How to Sew the John Bag by Amber Makes. Follow me and I'll show you how to make this beautiful bag available in 2 different prints. It can be a backpack, a handbag or a shoulder bag. Cutting out. Take the cotton drill panel that's in your kit, and if you have a look at it you can see all the pieces are labelled, the seam allowances are included in them and the label is above. Cut round the outer edge of each of them and then pin the label to the top. All the pieces for the outer and the pockets are on here. And you can see, here's the labels, and make sure you pin them to the top of the right side. You'll also have some lining fabric in your kit, and you'll have 2 zips, one for the pocket and one for the top of the bag. So now cut out everything and it will look like this. You can see I've pinned the labels on. If you're using the instructions and using your own fabric, the measurements are all listed in the instructions, but do label them by writing the names of them on a scrap of paper so that when you're making, you remember which piece is which. So if you're using your own fabric, you obviously have a different print here. But cut out everything. You've got straps and handles, the front outer, the back outer, the loop, there's all different pieces on there, but make sure that you label them because as you go along you need to know which is the top and which piece is which. Then you cut out the lining fabric pieces. The instructions tell you how to do this. For most of them you just use the outer pieces as templates. If you're using your own fabric, follow the instructions. Making the straps, handles and the back loop. Take one of these pieces, I'm using the strap here, and fold it in half with right sides facing lengthways and match the raw edges, and then pin it together all the way along the top edge. Start by pinning at one end and then go and pin at the other end, because if you pin all the way along and then get to the other end, sometimes it doesn't match up because of the fabric moving. So if you anchor it at one end and then the other end, then you can pin between. And make sure that the raw edges match up. You can press this in half first if you prefer and then pin it. It's entirely up to you. I'm just going to pin them together. Now once you've done that, sew it together all the way down the length. And you need to repeat that as well with the 2 handles. And do exactly the same by folding them in half with right sides facing. Take the label off when you're doing this, otherwise it will get inside and might get caught in the seam. You can always pin it back on after you've finished it so that you know which is which. You also need to do this with the backpack strap, which is a much longer piece. Again, exactly the same process. Fold it in half, right sides facing, pin it together all the way down the length and then sew it. Again, you can take the label off and pin it back on afterwards, but do take it off before you sew it. And then repeat this with the back loop. Again, sewing it together in a tube. So once you've sewn these all together, this is the handle. Now I'm going to use my turning tube to turn it right sides out. So you need to tack it together across one end to do that. Start by opening up that seam that you've just made and folding it open and flat. This just helps to get the seam laying flat when you turn it right sides out, because this will be running down the centre of the back when it's finished. So if you press it open now, you'll get a neater finish. Then turn it right sides out. If you're using a turning tube, it's much easier to do this and quicker. If you haven't got one, you'll just have to carefully turn it right sides out. So if you're using your turning tube, push the stick in. This fabric is quite stiff, but if you work gradually and just move those little folds down, you will be able to turn it. I turned all of mine right sides out using the turning tube. And then just pull it out and gradually pull all those folds down until it's right sides out. Just pulling all the ends out then, and if you've tacked it together across the end, just remove those tacking stitches. Always make sure that your tacking stitches are worked using the longest stitch length on your machine, and then they come out a lot quicker and easier. So once that's turned right sides out, rearrange it so that the seam is laying down the centre of the back. So just roll it between your fingers so it's nice and flat. And give it a press. If you turn it over, you can see where the print is. So what I did is I made sure it was running down the centre of the back, and then I rearranged it to make sure that the print lay evenly, because the prints have been designed so that when it's turned and laid like this, they're in the right place. And then top stitch along the top edge and the bottom edge. And that's that one handle finished. And it will look like this. It's a really nice, neat handle, and all the prints are designed and placed carefully so it looks designer. Make the two handles in the same way. And then make the strap. Again, you can see I've top stitched along both edges. The prints have designed so they're placed in exactly the right place. Make the back loop in the same way. Top turned right sides out and top stitched. And then finish off by making the long backpack strap. And you can see I've pinned all of my labels back on so that when I'm doing the assembly later, I know which piece is which. And that's all your straps, handles and back loop finished. Attaching the shoulder strap and the front handle. Take the bag front outer and lay it right sides up like this so that the short edge is running across the top, and then take the shoulder strap. Now measure 2.5 inches in from the left hand side and mark that place with a pin. Now take your shoulder strap, you can take the label off now, and place this right sides facing on top of the bag front outer so that the left side of the shoulder strap matches up with the pin. The shoulder strap needs to extend 1/2 inch above the top of the bag. This just makes it extra secure and means it won't get pulled out when you're carrying lots in your bag. Pin it into place, and then pin it into place a couple of inches down. You need to make sure it's straight. You can do this by measuring or by eye, and pin it just into place a couple of inches down, and that makes sure it's straight. Now repeat this to measure and mark 2.5 inches in from the right hand side and mark that with a pin on the top edge. Take the handle, run it through your fingers to make sure it doesn't get twisted, and lay it right sides facing so that the right hand side of it matches up with that pin, and make sure it extends 1/2 inch above the top of the bag, of the front outer. Pin it into place, and then again pin it into place a couple of inches further down, which you can do by measuring 2.5 inches in from the side, or you can just judge it, and that will just hold it straight. Now tack the shoulder strap into place across the top and a little bit further down using the longest stitch on your machine. The second row will be removed later, it's just to hold it straight during assembly. Then take one of the handles, and you can remove the label, and place this right sides down on the front outer. It needs to be lying inside and just next to, not overlapping, but not with a space, so just butting up to the shoulder strap and extending 1/2 inch above the top edge. You can do this by measuring or just line it up with the top of the shoulder strap. Pin it into place at the top and then a little bit further down, and this makes sure as well that it doesn't overlap the shoulder strap. It needs to be just next to it. And then making sure it's straight and not twisted, place the other end inside the other end of the shoulder strap. Again, make sure that it's not overlapping the shoulder strap, it's just touching. Pin it into place at the top and then a little bit further down. And then tack this into place in the same way across the top and a little bit further down. And then that's your shoulder strap and front handle attached to the bag. So you can see there I've tacked them into place, and that's all ready for the next stage. Attaching the back loop. This is used to thread the backpack strap through, so you need to make some marks on it to start with. So place it right sides up, and there's a diagram in the instructions that tells you where these marks should be. So if you follow the diagram, now use a pen that will show up. So I'm using a chalk pen because it's on dark fabric. You could use an erasable pen. It needs to be something where the marks can be removed, but so that it shows up. So use a light pen for dark fabric or a dark pen for light fabric. So you're measuring 3 inches from the left hand edge and 1.5 inches to the right of it. Then 2 3/4 inch from the left and 1.5 inches to the right of it. But just follow the diagram in the instructions because that's a lot easier. So once you've made those 4 marks, join the 2 marks on the left in a diagonal line, because you're going to stitch diagonal lines, and then move along, and the next two marks, the one at the top and one at the bottom, join those with a diagonal line. So you've got two diagonal lines facing this way, and then on the right hand side repeat the same thing. So measure and mark, following the diagram in the instructions, 3 inches from the right hand side and 1.5 inches inwards, so to the left of that, and then measure 2 3/4 inch from the right hand side, and then 1.5 inches to the left of that. So again, you've got the 4 marks, and join them together, and this time the diagonal lines will face in the opposite direction. This just means that the backpack strap will lay through it diagonally, which means it's a lot more even and will fit better than it being straight. It's just a little bit of a change to having a straight one, but it just means it lays flatter on your finished bag. So now you've got all of your diagonal lines marked. Now take the back outer and measure 1.5 inches down from the top. And mark that. You can do that with a pen or with a pin. I'm doing that on one side and the other side. Obviously with this design, it's got printed lines so you can see where they are. But if you're using your own plain fabric or you're using the other design, you need to get this straight. So do make a couple of measurements and place the top edge of the back loop at that measurement. You can also measure in the centre as well, because it's very important that this lays straight, because you're going to be sewing it to the back outer in a moment. So pin it together at either end. The back loop is exactly the same size, the same width as the back outer. Pin it either end, and then I'm also going to put a pin in the middle just to keep it straight while I'm sewing. Now tack it within the seam allowance at either end to hold it still, and then sew on top of these lines, following the instructions. So you basically start in the centre, stitch to the top, stitch down, back to the centre, and then do it again. It's really important that these seams are really strong, so you stitch over them twice. And now you can see I've got these little gaps, and that's where the backpack strap is going to go through. Attaching the backpack strap and the back handle. So take the back outer that you've already put the loop on and take the backpack strap. You can remove the label from this now. And we need to place it so it's right sides up on top of this back outer. Right, first of all, thread it right sides up through the gap that you left in those stitching on the left, and then back down through the gap on the right. Make sure it's not twisted, so just run it through your fingers, make sure that it's right sides up. It might twist as you're going through, so make sure it's right sides up and it's not twisted, and then pull it up so it loops up between the handles, because we're going to be sewing the bottom edges to the bottom of the back outer. So just double check again, because once it's sewn in place you'd have to unpick it if it was twisted, so make sure it's not twisted and laying nice and flat. Now we need to make some measurements, so measure 1 inch in from the left hand side of the back outer and just place a pin there. Now, just like with the strap, the backpack strap needs to extend 1/2 inch below the bottom edge just to make it more secure. So just mark that 1/2 inch on the strap. Now place the left-hand side of the strap at that 1 inch pin. Now before you pin it in place, to make sure this backpack strap lies nice and neatly, it needs to be at a slight angle. So if you just hold it in place, and then where it goes through the loop, just give it a little pull. So you can see now it's laying across the back outer at a slight angle. This just is only just very slight, but it will just make it neater than if you sewed it in straight. So pin it into place. So it needs to extend 1/2 inch below the bottom edge, 1 inch from the left, and be at this little slight angle, so that when you're using it as a backpack, it will lie nice and flat. It's this little extra addition that will give you a more professional finish. And then we're going to do the same on the other side. So again, measure 1 inch in from the right hand side and mark with a pin. Measure on the backpack strap 1/2 inch from the bottom, and then lay that on top so that it's 1/2 inch below the bottom and it's 1 inch from the right. And then again, just lay it out the strap so it has that little angle. So it's just laying slightly diagonally. Pin it into place at the bottom and then a little bit further up so that we can tack it into place to hold it straight just while you're assembling the backpack. So tack it across the bottom and then a little bit higher up, and then the angle will stay and it will be nice and straight. So there we go, your backpack strap is now attached. We're now going to put the back handle in. So take the other handle piece and fold the backpack strap downwards so it's out of the way while you're doing this. Now you need to measure in from the right hand side 3.5 inches. All these measurements are given in the instructions, so you can just use that if you want to just check all the measurements. But measure that in from the left hand side and the same measurement in from the right hand side. Now the handle needs to go right sides down on top, and just as before, it needs to extend 1/2 inch above the top edge. So I'm going to mark that onto the handle at both ends before I begin. Just then it's done before. It's easier to sometimes do this and then it's in place before you're trying to pin it into place. And now then make sure it's right sides down, and the left hand side of the handle needs to be at that mark, and it needs to extend the 1/2 inch above the top. So just pin it into place and then pin it into place a little bit further down. You'll tack it above where the backpack strap comes in place. I'm just moving out of the way, but you'll be tacking above it. Make sure it's not twisted. Run it through your fingers and pin the right hand side of the handle at that 3.5 inch mark, making sure it's extending 1/2 inch above the top, and then pin it into place a little bit further down. Now before you tack it, it's important that this handle is in exactly the same place as the handle that you tack to the front outer. So although you've measured it, I would just at this stage double check by placing the front outer on top of the back outer and make sure the ends of those handles meet up. If they don't, just adjust it slightly before you tack it into place. If you've done all the measurements correct, it will, but it's just worth checking. Then this is what it will look like once you've tacked it into place at the top and a little bit further down, but not into the backpack straps. So that's the backpack strap and the handle all attached. Making the sleeve pocket. Take the sleeve pocket outer and the sleeve pocket lining. You can remove the labels now and place them right sides facing. They're exactly the same size, because if you've used your own fabric, the measurements in the instructions show they're the same size, and if you've used this as a template, the sleeve pocket, and pin them together just along the top edge, making sure that the raw edges are matching and that they're right sides facing, and then sew them together along the top edge. Once that's done, you need to press this seam open and flat. So open up the two pieces, place them right sides down on your ironing board or mat, and press that seam open and flat. This just helps to keep the seam laying right on the edge in a moment, so do take the time to do this. Now refold it so that the two pieces, the lining and the outer, are wrong sides facing, and roll that seam between your fingers and press it so that it's right on the edge. You can use a little bit of steam, but I find to get a seam laying right on the edge, if you give it a quick spray with water and then press it on an iron board, particularly if you've got a pressing mat, you get a nice edge. Then top stitch along the top and then tack all the way around the edges. Make sure the raw edges match up. So that top stitching is the top of your pocket and the tacking just holds it in place. So tack within the seam allowance. Now take the lining of the bag. So you're taking the back lining. They're the same size, the back and the front, but you need the back lining for this. And place the sleeve pocket on top. The side and the bottom raw edges should meet up, because obviously the pocket is set down a bit from the top. So match up the side and the bottom raw edges of the back lining and your sleeve pocket that you've just assembled, and pin it together all the way around, so down the sides and across the bottom. I would take the time here to just measure that the sleeve pocket is the same distance from the top of the back lining at both sides at this stage, and that just ensures your pocket is laying straight. And then tack it within the seam allowance down the side, across the bottom and up the other side. And now your sleeve pocket is complete. I'm using mine to put a laptop in. If you want to divide it into sections, you can do that at this stage by sewing vertically down through the pocket, and that's finished. Making the zip pocket. Take the zip pocket front, and we're going to draw some lines on it on the wrong side. So place it wrong sides up so that the long edge is at the top. and you need to draw a line 1.5 inches down from that top edge on the wrong side, all the way along using an eraser pen or a pencil. Then move your ruler and measure 1/4 inch below this, and then another line 1/4 inch below that. You can use a tape measure and another ruler for it if you prefer. I'm just using this ruler because it's easier. So you've got 3 parallel lines spaced 1/4 inch apart. Now just fold this in half, the zip pocket front. This is just to find the centre. You can do that by measuring if you prefer. So just mark that centre because you'll use this in a moment. Now those 3 lines need to be 6 inches long and placed centrally. So if you mark 3 inches from the centre to the right and turn it round and mark 3 inches from the centre to the right again, then you've got they're 6 inches and they are placed centrally. So that little box of 3 lines is 6 inches long. Draw diagonal lines going from the corners to the centre line. These will be cutting lines for later. Now, take the bag front lining and place this zip pocket front right sides facing on top. So right sides facing on the front lining. It needs to be positioned 2 inches from the top edge of the bag front lining. So just mark that and then put it into place. And it needs to also be positioned centrally. So the easiest way to do this is to take your front lining, fold it in half like this, and just mark that crease. And then if you open it up, the crease that you've got on your zip pocket front, you can match up and then you know they're central. And then just measure on the front lining. If you measure 2 inches down from the top onto that centre crease, then you know that the pocket front is going to be placed exactly centrally and 2 inches down from the top. You can do all of this by measuring if you prefer. I just find by doing these creases this way it's easier. But just make sure that the zip pocket front is 2 inches down from the top of the front lining and centrally. Now pin it into place. It's easy if you keep these pins in when you're sewing, so place them away from that centre box. So I always place mine about 1/2 inch away from the centre box, and it just means I can keep them into place and not have to take them out while I'm sewing. Now you need to sew around the outer box only. So as I'm showing you with my pen here, not along the diagonal lines and not along the centre line. So I've done this now, so you can see I've just sewn along the outer box. You can remove the pins now. Now to make the opening, we're going to cut along that centre line. So if you fold the whole thing in half, like this, just make a small snip through all the layers and then open it up. This is just so you can get your scissors inside. And then cut through all the layers along that centre line, stop when you reach the end of the diagonal lines, and then very carefully cut along the diagonal lines and into the corner. Just take care that you don't snip the stitches that you've already worked. If you do, don't worry, just pop it back under your machine and restitch them. But this just will help this post box opening to lie flat by doing these little diagonal lines. So just cut those nice and carefully right up to the seam, but not actually into it. So that's the opening all done. Now we need to press this open. So we'll turn this right way around. So start by opening up the seams there and pressing them open. This is because this seam needs to lay right on the edge in a moment, and I find it easier if you press this seam open at this stage. It just is easier to get it done. So open it up, and those little diagonal flaps on the corner as well. They're quite small, but just open those up and give that a good press. If you're working with thicker fabric like the drill or a canvas, you might find the little spray of water helps to keep those seams open. And I always use a pressing mat when I'm working with fabrics like this because you get a neater press. But just use a little spray of water, or you can use steam if you prefer. Now rearrange it all so you can see this zip pocket front is right sides up. And then just roll these seams between your fingers so that they lay right on the edge. The aim here is that you can't see the zip pocket front from the lining side, and you can't see the lining from the zip pocket front side. Obviously, this zip pocket will be in the inside. So the most important thing, and I always start by pressing this side, so you can see everything's nice and even and flat. And then I turn it over, because this is the side that you'll see from the inside of the bag. And just make sure that I can't see any of the zip pocket fabric. So once you've done all of that, you can now then pop your zip. So take your pocket zip and place it right sides up. And then place the postbox opening centrally on top of that. The opening is smaller than the length of the zip teeth to make this easier to do. So you don't want the metal end to be near the seam, so place that away because you're going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch to the right of that postbox opening. So make sure the metal end that closes the teeth together isn't near that because you don't want to stitch through it. And then if you push pins through the postbox opening and into the zip, that's why if you place it on an ironing board and mat, this is easier. You can adjust it and get everything nicely in place before you actually pin, because the zip teeth need to run centrally across the centre of this postbox opening. So once you've got everything pinned into place and the teeth are running centrally, you can then pin it properly. So where you've got the teeth extending, you now need to move the slider, and it's easier to do that when everything's pinned like this, inside the opening, because otherwise you will end up sewing across the slider. So once you've done that, you can then pin the ends of the tape into place through all the layers. And then you know that they're together exactly. So by just pushing the pins in and then moving the slider, you will get a neater finish and the zip will stay together at the end. You can then simply push these pins through the fabric. So if you pull them out slightly from your ironing board and then push them in, you don't actually have to take them out completely. And then pin the ones at the end. I like to turn it round so the pins are facing the opposite direction that I'm sewing. They're easier to take out as you're sewing. And then pin it together, zip into place through all the layers. Just making sure that it all stays nice and straight, and those zip teeth, if anything moves, just readjust it like this and make sure those zip teeth are running straight through the centre of this pocket. This is a really good practice way to put in a zip if you haven't done it before, because it's just a pocket and it's a really good way of having a go and seeing about putting in zips. Once you're all pinned nicely into place and everything's even, sew it into place all the way around the edge. Again, about 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, like this. Now you just need to trim the ends of the zip because the zip is longer than you need. So I trim them to about 1/2 an inch outside the box, because then the tape won't be in this pocket seams later. So your zip's all neatly in place. Now take the zip pocket back and place that right sides facing on top, making sure the top edge of the zip pocket back is facing upwards, because this is the one if you've got the kit with the printed design on it. And then pin the zip pocket front and the zip pocket back together all the way round, matching raw edges, but don't pin into the lining fabric. This is really important because you are only going to be sewing the zip pocket front and back together and not into the lining fabric. And the reason for that is you don't want it to be able to see. And the only sewing that you will see for this pocket on the lining is around that postbox opening. You don't want to be able to see this lining. It keeps the pocket invisible, and you also have a neater finish. So make sure you only pin through the pocket pieces. So I've pinned it together down the side, down the bottom, now across the side. Pin the top two corners together first and then pin between. So make sure the raw edges of it match. You can just adjust these slightly. And then pin it together across the top edges. Again, you've got the two sides into place now. So move it down to make sure that the raw edges are matching up. They're both exactly the same size, so they will match. And then once you've done that, sew the pocket front to the pocket back all the way around. You don't need to leave any gaps, all the way around, but not into the lining. And then it will look like this. So you can see the pocket I've sewn together all the way around. It's not sewn into the lining. If you turn it over, there's your neat little zip. When you open it up, there's the zip pocket back, and you can see the little elephant looking at you, or whatever print that you've got on your kit or your own fabric. And your zip pocket is now finished. Making the outer and the lining. Take the gusset outer pieces, so you've got two side gusset outers and a base gusset outer. Now you're going to sew these together in one long line. So sew the bottom edge of one side gusset outer to the side edge of one base gusset outer. You can see like this, so you're matching up the side edges. If you've got a print, then make sure the print matches up. Place them right sides facing and sew them together. But you need to start and finish stitching 1/4 inch from each end. So it's easier if you mark this into place first. This just helps the gusset to sew around the bag easier. So pin them together, making sure the raw edges match. And then sew them together, starting at 1/4 inch mark and finishing at the other. Don't forget to reverse stitch at either end to make those nice and secure. And then it will look like this. Open up that seam and press it open. I do it from both sides just to make sure it's nice and flat and pressed open. So that's one side gusset attached to the base gusset. Now you need to attach the bottom end of the other side gusset to the other end of the base gusset. Just make sure that everything matches up. And then place it right sides facing and sew it together. If you're using your own fabric and it doesn't match up, it doesn't really matter. These seams will be right at the bottom of the bag. But in the kit, the fabrics have been designed so that it matches up like this. So again, mark and 1/4 inch, measure and mark 1/4 inch in from either end. Pin it together, making sure that the raw edges are matching. And then sew these together, starting at one mark and finishing at the other. Once that's done, it will look like that, and you can see the 1/4 inch is left unstitched, and I've pressed the seam open and flat, so the gusset outer is now finished. So we're now going to sew it to the bag front outer. So place this right sides up and place the side gusset right sides down on top along the right hand side. I'm just turning it round to make it easier to sew. So pin it into place, matching up that top corner, and so making sure the raw edges match. And I'm also going to pin it into place a little bit further down. This just helps to keep it still when you start sewing and nice and straight. And then pin it at the other end. So you can see with those pressed that seam allowance pressed open, the open side of the right hand seam allowance will line up with that top right hand corner. So the seam that joins the side gusset to the base gusset will be 1/4 inch above the bottom of that main fabric of the front outer. So make sure that the seam is 1/4 inch above the bottom, and that pressed open seam allowance matches the corner of the front outer. And then pin it together between. Now sew from the top, but stop stitching exactly on that seam and reverse stitch a bit. Don't stitch beyond it. Once that's done, it will look like this. And now because you left that 1/4 inch unstitched, when you turn this round to pin the base gusset in place, it will fold round nicely. So start by pinning it, making sure that the edge of that seam allowance matches up with the right hand side of the front outer so that the seam is 1/4 inch from the end. So pin it into place then. I like to pin through both seam allowances. It holds them flat and keeps everything steady so that you can stop stitching on the seam. Now at this side, you can see it will fold open nicely like this, and you will end up with like a little corner, and that gives you a nice crisp corner. So pin the seam allowance into place, making sure you've got that nice little corner, and then pin between the two. So just give them a little pull and make sure the raw edges match up. And then pin between from one end to the other. So you can see on that left hand side you've got a nice corner, and on the right hand side you've got those two seam allowances. So start stitching at one end, stitch all the way along and finish exactly on the seam. Don't stitch beyond it. And once it's stitched, it will look like this. And then to sew it up the other side, it's exactly the same. Turn it round, match up that end of the side gusset to the top edge of the front, and pin it into place. And then I pin it into place just a bit further down. It's just sometimes it can shift a little bit, and I find if you just anchor it into place just a bit further down, it holds it still. And then at this end, again, open up that seam allowance and pin it into place to leave a little square corner on the front outer. Because if you don't leave these 1/4 inches unstitched, it's quite hard to get it to bend round the corner. So just by taking the time to do that, you just get an easier finish, and it's a lot easier to get it to go around the corner when you're sewing as well. Again, match up those raw edges. And pin it into place. And then sew, starting at one end and working all the way up to the top. And then it will look like this. So the gusset strip is now attached to the front outer. Take the time at this stage to press these seams open. It's a lot easier to press the seams open as you go than after the whole thing is constructed. So press the seams open, or when you're working along the bottom, just press the seam over to one side. Particularly when you get nearer the corners, it's easier to do that. So do that all the way round. And now you can attach it to the back outer. So take your back outer with all your straps and everything, your backpack straps, fold those to the inside because you really don't want to get these caught in this seam, so keep them out of the way. And place this right sides down on top. So we're going to sew the other side of the side gusset to the back outer. This is done in exactly the same way by sewing down one side, pivoting at the seams and sewing back up the other side. So do it, just follow the video, the instructions. It is done in exactly the same way. And when you've sewn it, it will look like this. So you can see all of the outer, the front and the back outer are now attached to the gusset, and those seams lay right on the edges. And I've pressed all the seams open, so the outer section of your bag is finished. Now we're going to make the lining section in exactly the same way. So take this two side gusset linings and the base gusset lining and sew them together just as you did with the outer, so that it goes side gusset, base gusset, side gusset. And make sure you leave 1/4 inch unstitched at either end. So I'm just going to pin these together. I'm putting another set down because the lining fabric's a bit thinner, so it's just to keep it even. And I'm going to use a chalk pencil for this, just because it's a darker fabric and I want to be able to see it. So mark the 1/4 inch and then sew between the 1/4 inch. And then when you finish that, take the other side gusset lining and sew that to the other end of the base gusset lining. Again, I like to pin it into place and then make the marks 1/4 inch from the left and 1/4 inch from the right. You've already done this with the outer pieces, so you'll know how you do it now. And again, stitch between these, making sure you don't stitch beyond the marks. And then your gusset lining is complete. Press those seams open as before. Then take the front lining, this is the one that's got your zip pocket attached, and place the gusset down the side, just like you did with the outer, and sew it together all the way around, making sure that you don't stitch beyond the seam, and pivot so that you stitch it together all the way round, just like you did with the outer, and then it will look like this. So the gusset is attached to this. Now we're going to attach it to the back lining. This is the one with the sleeve pocket attached. So this will be sewn all the way around. The only difference is you need to leave a turning gap in this seam, because this is what you'll turn your bag right sides out with. So fold or measure to find the centre of the base gusset edge. So the base gusset that's not sewn, the raw edge, find the centre of that. And then measure 3 inches either side of that. And that will leave you a 6-inch gap that's in the centre. It's a lot easier if you mark this gap before you pin and sew. So in exactly the same way, pin and sew the other raw edge of the side gusset like this down the right hand side of the back lining, and then sew it together along the base, but leave that turning gap unstitched. So stitch from one end, stop at the turning gap, leave it unstitched and go to the corner, and then sew the other side of the side gusset up the other side. And now this is the lining finished. So I've taken the time now, I've pressed all of my seams open and flat. I press the turning gap, press those edges over by 1/4 of an inch like this, so that when you sew it up later, it's all now turned over to the wrong side. And that's your lining finished. Making the zip panel, we're going to start by inserting the zip. So take one zip panel outer and the bag zip, this is the longer zip, and place it right sides facing on top of the zip panel outer, but on top of that cut out edge. So the long edge that's shorter because you've got the cut out corners, place it right sides facing on that. So make sure the zip is central. It's longer than you need to make it easier to fit. So measure to make sure it's central, and then make sure that the raw edge of the fabric of the zip panel outer matches up with the edge of the zip tape. Do double check that the zip is central, because you will be trimming it later, but it's a lot easier to work with a zip that's a little bit longer, but it is important that it's central. So make sure that you're pinning it along the bottom edge, which has the cut-out corners. Now, once you've done that, tack the zip to the zip panel outer, but within the seam allowance, using a long stitch and just a little bit from the edge, it's just a holding stitch, and it will look like this. So it's just tacked about 1/8 of an inch from the end. And then take one of the zip panel lining pieces. There are 2 of these, so put one to one side for now. You'll be using that in a moment. And take the other one and place that right sides facing on top. Make sure it matches up so that the cut-out corner on the lining matches up with the cut-out corner on the outer. Now make sure that the edges of this match up. So I'm just flipping it over a little bit just to make sure those corners match up, and also that the raw edge of the lining matches up. And you can see that the sides match up there. Pin it into place at the other side. Again, just checking that the corner, you can push a pin through if you like, so you can see where it comes out on there, and then match that up. And then pin them together. The sides will match up of the lining and the outer as well now, because they are exactly the same size. And then pin the 3 layers together so that the raw edge of the outer and the lining match up, and that the zip is sandwiched between, and the zip tape will all match up as well. So we're basically sewing these 3 layers together, but by tacking the zip to the outer first, it's much easier to do this. Now stitch this into place using your zip foot with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And it will look like this. So the 3 layers are now stitched together. You will need a zip foot so that you don't sew over the teeth. Now refold this so that the lining and the outer are wrong sides facing, and then the zip is facing away. So the zip is now right sides up, the outer and the lining are right sides up, but they're wrong sides facing, obviously. And press this seam that you've just sewn so it lays right on the edge. Press it from the outer side and then the lining side. So if you just push the lining over with your fingers a little bit, like this, just to make sure that it's exactly flat, and you'll see that all the raw edges of the outer and the lining will now match up. Now we're going to sew the other side of the zip to the other zip panel outer. Again, you'll be sewing the bottom edge, the one with the cut-out corners, to the zip tape. Now it's important that this is in exactly the same place as you sewed the first zip panel outer in. So if you match up the side edges like I'm doing here, you can see if you match up the side, moving it up slightly, then this means that you're sewing the other zip panel outer in exactly the same place to the zip. So in the same way as before, pin at either end and then pin between, making sure that the raw edge of the zip panel outer matches up with the zip tape. And you can see that those side edges are nice and level. And then when you've done that, tack it into place again using a long stitch and within your seam allowance. And then if you do it within your seam allowance, you won't have to remove the tacking stitches. Now take the other zip panel lining that you put to one side and place this right sides facing with the outer that you've just sewn on, so the zip is sandwiched between. Again, make sure that the corner of that lining matches up with the corner of the outer. So pin at one side and then pin at the other side. So I'm going to just push a pin through just where the outer meets the zip and then line that up. By taking the time to do these little things like making sure the edges line up, making sure the sides line up, and also tacking the zip into place first and then sewing, you will just get a neater finish. This isn't a difficult job to do this, doing these inserted zip, recess zips. Not difficult, just take your time to get everything to match up, and then using your zip foot, sew it into place through all 3 layers. Once that's done, it will look like that. Again, open out the fabrics so that the outer and the lining are wrong sides facing, and then press so that seam is laying right on the edge. Always press from both sides, because once you press the outer, sometimes the lining can just bunch up a little bit inside or go back. Even if I always pull them to match the raw edges, but if you just press from this side, and again I would suggest a little spray of water on this if you're using a thicker fabric, just helps. Then top stitch down both sides, so you're doing your stitches about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. They'll go through the outer and the lining, and this just holds the outer and the lining into place and gives you a neater finish. Now move the slider to the centre. We're just going to sew across the ends. So sew across the ends of the zip at both ends, level with those cut out edges. You see they're just level with those cut out edges, and I've just sewn through the teeth. Don't cut it yet. We'll leave the rest of the tape in place. Boxing the zip panel ends. So take your zip panel that you've been sewing with and open out the 2 outer pieces on one side, just like this, and place the 2 sides right sides facing. So you match up the raw edges on the top, and then the raw edges, you can see where the start of that cutout corner is. Pin them together, and then take the 2 lining pieces and place those right sides facing and pin together, making sure the cutout corner, the side and the top raw edges match up. And then when you've pinned them together, sew the 2 outer pieces together, and then sew the 2 lining pieces together. And it will look like this. So there's the outers sewn together, and there's the lining sewn together, and the zip is just sitting between. And then repeat that on the other side. Take the 2 outer pieces, match up all those raw edges, so on the cutout corners, along the side, and across the top long edge. Because the zip panel outers are the same size, this will all fit together beautifully. And then repeat that to pin the 2 lining sides right sides facing. It may seem a little odd why you're doing these seams like this, but when you've got your fabric piece that you've sewn and you watch this video, it will all make sense, and it turns it into the recessed zip panel that you're achieving. And then sew the lining together, and then sew the outer together. So once you've done that, it now looks like a little boat, but we're going to give this little boat some structure. Make sure the slider's in the middle so it's out of the way. Now on one of the ends, open up that seam allowance, and you can just finger press it. And then the top of that seam needs to sit right in the centre of the zip teeth, and the bottom of the seam needs to sit right in the centre of the zip teeth. So basically the seam will be sitting exactly centrally on top of the zip teeth. Make sure that it does sit centrally on the zip teeth, and then the seam will be at the end of the panel when you've finished it. And then just pin this into place. Don't worry if that cutout corner isn't exactly on the top and you've got a little bit down like mine. Depending on how far you've top stitched and your seam allowance, it may be slightly different. The most important thing is these layers are laying flat, and that this seam, once open, lays on top of the teeth. So turn it over, and you can see here I'm working from the lining side. So make sure that the seam sits right on top of the zip teeth centrally, and then the bottom of the seam sits on the top of the teeth. And if you make sure the top and the bottom sit centrally on top of the zip teeth, then this seam will be straight. Once you've done that, you can then pin it on the side. So just smooth it out with your fingers. I find you just need to rearrange everything a little bit because you've got these corners and the zip and everything. So if you just rearrange it slightly, make sure that the seam's sitting on the teeth, smooth it out, and then you can pin the lining. Now turn it over because we're going to sew all this together, but from the outer side. So pin all these layers together, so you're pinning these folded linings, the folded outers, all together. Once you've pinned them all together, just check on the lining side that you haven't got any pins in the way. You can remove any of the placement pins you've put in. And now sew together across the top 1/4 inch from the top. So it will look like this. So you can see the seam is 1/4 of an inch from that top straight edge. I've still got my zip poking out. But what we're going to do now is trim, move the slider out of the way a bit, trim the zip tape so it's level. So it looks like a box corner. So that seam is 1/4 inch from the top. Now repeat that to sew the other side, the outer and the lining together in exactly the same way. And then when you've done that, trim the zip tape so it's level. So it's much easier to trim the zip tape at the end. Now push out the corners so you can see the zip is now in the centre of that little box corner. Push out the corners. And then you need to just pin these together. So take the seam of the outer and the seam of the lining and place them wrong sides facing exactly on top of each other. And then turn it around and do the same at the other side. So take that outer seam, place it right sides facing on top of the lining seam and pin together. Now you can pin them together all the way around. So the outer and the lining are wrong sides facing. Make sure that the raw edges match up. They're exactly the same size, so they will fit all the way around. But by pinning the seams first, it just gives you some anchoring points. And now all the sewing that you've done to insert the zip and create those box corners, that's all covered because it's fully lined. The lining covers all of that, so it looks really neat. So from the outside of the bag, you'll see the outer, and then from the inside, you'll see the lining. But it just keeps all of that stitching and trimming, and the cut-out corners are what create that little corner, the box corner on the zip. So once it's pinned together all the way around, tack it together all the way around within the seam allowance, and then you won't need to remove the tacking stitches later. And then it will look like this. And your recessed zip panel is now complete. And it's really neat. You can give it a nice press, but look how neat it is and fairly easy to do and creates a nice finish to your bag. Assembling the bag. So your bag outer needs to be wrong sides out, and all the handles and straps need to be facing downwards, so they're out of the way of the top edge so that you don't sew them. I'm just removing some of the labels that I've forgotten to take off earlier. So make sure everything is facing inwards so you don't get it caught in the seam, so just push it all downwards. Now start off by, you need to find the centre of the side gussets. So if you paste the two side gusset seams, the ones that join it to the front and the back outer, together, then place a pin where that fold is, and that's the centre, or you can just measure between them. So then take the other side top edge of the side gusset and either place the seams together. I'm just opening them up to make sure they're exactly on top of each other, and then fold it in half and place a pin, and that's the halfway point. Or as I said, you can measure between, but you need the centre of these side edges so that for when you're attaching the zip panel. So once that's done, take the zip panel that you've just made and place it right sides facing with the bag outer. Match up that seam, so that side seam that's on the zip panel, with the centre of the side gussets, so that pin that you've just marked earlier. Do it on one side, and then work round to the other side again. Make sure the zip panel and the bag outer are right sides facing, and match that seam on the zip panel to that centre mark of the side gussets. Then it's just positioned in the right place. So pin that together. Now you've anchored it in the right place, you can then pin the zip panel to the bag outer all the way round. So match up the raw edges. I like to work from one side and then to the other. As you can see, all of the straps and the handles are poking 1/2 inch above because that gives them extra security. The zip panel will fit exactly inside the bag outer because I've worked all the measurements out and calculated it so it does. So don't worry as you're going around thinking it won't be big. If you find that anything looks like it's not, just give it a little pull, because sometimes with all the sewing and the pressing, things distort a little bit. So just give them a little pull, and also you've got seams in the bag outer and that pulls the fabric in a little bit. You need to keep those seams open, so I always pin those open when I'm sewing. If when you get to the other side you think, oh, well, it doesn't fit, just ease it very gently because they have been calculated to fit exactly. And again, pin those seams open and then they'll stay open. And then just make sure the raw edges match up, and also that the ends of those straps don't get tucked in so that they're still poking 1/2 inch above. And make sure that all the straps and handles are facing downwards so you don't sew them into this seam. Now sew the panel, zip panel, to the bag outer all the way around the edge. And then it will look like this. So you've now attached. Now open the zip fully on the zip panel. Now take your lining. And the lining needs to be turned right sides out. So turn it all right sides out so you can see all the pockets. And place that inside your bag. So place the lining inside the bag outer, and now they will be right sides facing. So just put it inside and you now need to match up the seams. So you've got the seams that join the side gusset to the fronts and backs. So just match those up. And then you've got it in the right place. So just make sure that those two seams lie on top of each other and pin them together. Obviously you are sandwiching the zip gusset between the lining and the outer, and this is what will make it sit right on the top. And then match the other side gusset seam of the outer to the side gusset seam of the lining. It's important that these match up, and then the lining will sit exactly straight inside the outer, otherwise it will be a bit twisted. So do make sure you match up these seams before you do anything else. And again, remember because you've sewn the zip panel into place, I always tack the zip panel into place. You can see from here I tacked it within the seam allowance. That just means I don't have to take those tacking stitches out later. And by doing it together in sections like this, it keeps the zip panel attached to the outer, so that sewing the lining in place, you don't have to hold everything together. Because when you're sewing 3 layers together, some things sometimes slip. So do make sure that when you sew the zip panel to the bag outer, that you tack it within the seam allowance, and then you won't have to remove the stitches after. So you can see I'm working all the way around in exactly the same way as I put the zip panel in. Just pin the line together. You can see they're right sides facing, and because you've anchored them at those zip gusset, the side pant gusset seams first, everything stays nice and straight. And the lining, as you know, is exactly the same size as the outer, so it will fit. Just make sure that your raw edges match up. And once that's done, sew it into the lining to the outer, encasing the zip panel all the way round using a normal 1/4 inch seam allowance and a normal stitch length. And now your lining and your outer are all joined together. Finishing the bag. So take your bag and pull the bag outer and the bag lining apart so that they're lying flat. So you've got one on one side and one on the other, and the seam that you joined them together is in the middle. Now press this seam open. Later on we want to have this seam laying right on the top. So if you press it open from the inside now, it's a lot easier to get it laying on the top. Obviously you've got this, with the kit you've got this heavier weight cotton drill. So again, if you give it a little spray, it will just help that to lay flat. Do that all the way around. Now I'm going to show you a little technique to join the outer to the lining at the bottom edges. You don't have to do this, but it does make it a little neater. So place one of the seam that joins the side gusset to the base gut of the outer, to the seam that joins the side gusset and the base gusset of the lining. You've pressed those seams open and sewn them together, but now you need to just refold them so that the raw edges are all matching, and pin them together. You won't be able to pin them together at the edges because of all the seams and the corners, so just pin them down the centre. If you leave a 1/2 to 1 inch unpinned at either end, that's fine. This is just a way of anchoring the bottom of your bag together to hold the lining inside, and then sew together. Sew within the seam allowance. And again, remember, you won't be able to sew up to the edges. It's just an anchoring. So you can see here, I've only just sewn like that. Then repeat it with the other side. Take the outer gusset, side gusset seam, follow your finger along to join it to the corresponding lining gusset seam. and then fold them over so they join up like this, and then pin them together in the same way. Remember, you won't be able to pin up to the sides. So these two seams will hold the bottom of the lining inside the bag so that it won't come out, because sometimes if you don't attach your lining to the bottom of the bag, it pulls out. It also gives the bag a little bit more structure. You don't have to do this. It makes no difference to the finish of the bag. It's just it will hold the lining inside. If you prefer, you can just over sew these at the edges by hand if you don't want to do the machine stitching. It's just anchoring the lining gusset to the outer gusset. So again, stitch between where you've pinned. The edges are unstitched, but that doesn't matter, and that's just anchored it in place. Now when you've done that, you can turn your bag right sides out through the turning gap that you left in the lining. So push your hand inside. I've made the turning gap big enough so that the whole bag will push right sides out. Obviously this is a heavyweight fabric. You've got straps and loops and handles, so there's a lot to push through, but I have made the turning gap big enough to do this, but not too big so that you can't sew it together. So once that's done, push the whole thing out. And it's all nice right sides out. Just check at this stage before you sew the lining that everything is sewn neatly into place and that you haven't caught in any handles or anything or missed any seams. I always turn it out to the outer side just to make sure everything's neat and I've done everything correctly. Then, because you folded the edges of your turning gap under earlier, they will have stayed folded under. And then just place those folded under edges together and pin together. So you're basically pinning the turning gap closed, making sure that the edges of the outer, the lining either side of the turning gap are inside so that you don't have any raw edges or loose threads coming through. Pin them together all the way along. So you can see the turning gap does have a little space either side with seams, but it was big enough to turn the bag through. And then stitch the turning gap closed. You can either top stitch from machine all the way along, or you can slip stitch by hand. When it's done, I top stitch mine. It will look like this. And now you can turn your whole bag right sides out. So push everything to the inside, push out those corners. And because I've attached my lining to the outer, this pushes out really easily and there's a little bit more structure. And you see, you can't see those seams because I work them in the seam allowance. And then we're going to sew this seam that's at the top that joins the outer to the zip gusset just to hold it inside. So I'm just folding it into the inside. Now, it's really important that the handles and the straps all face upwards when you do this. So the extra row of tacking stitches you worked when you attached the handles and the straps and the backpack strap, you need to remove. These were just to keep them straight during assembly. So take these out at this stage because these straps and handles need to be facing upwards. Once you've done them, do remove all the little loose threads as well and do it on both sides. Obviously, you didn't put any tacking stitches in the backpack strap, so that needs to be facing downwards out of the way, but the handle and the shoulder strap need to be facing upwards. So once you've removed all those tacking stitches, fold the zip panel to the inside so that that seam, the seam that you sewed the outer, the lining, the zip out together, the one that lays right across the top, that needs to be laying on the top edge. Give it a press to make sure that it is, and also make sure that the handle and the strap is facing upwards. So just roll it between your fingers and press it, and then top stitch 1/4 inch from the top edge all the way around, and it will look like this. So this just gives a really nice neat edge, and it also holds the zip panel to the inside and gives you a much more professional finish. So now your John bag is finished. It's got a lovely sleeve pocket, it's got a zip pocket, the lining is held beautifully inside. The recessed zip panel means that everything's kept safe, and you've got a little zip recess, but it's a good place to put your umbrella if it's wet. Now you can use it either as a handbag with handles, you can use the shoulder straps to sling it over your shoulder, but when you've got a lot inside and you want hands free, just pull the backpack strap through like this, and then automatically you've got backpack straps. So your beautiful, versatile John bag is now finished and ready to show off.